Vilya tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase as the boarding agent frowned at the computer screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the young woman said. "Your name isn't on this reservation." Before Vilya could answer, her mother-in-law stepped forward with a satisfied smile. "That's because I had it removed." The words landed harder than the ocean breeze, rolling across the pier. Margaret Brooks folded her designer sunglasses onto the collar of her blouse and nodded toward the gangway where hundreds of passengers were already boarding the massive cruise ship. "I gave your cabin to my best friend, Linda. She deserves the vacation much more than you do." Vilya stared at her. "You removed me." "I certainly did," Margaret shrugged. "Someone had to make a decision." Around them, members of the Brooks family suddenly became fascinated with their luggage. No one spoke. Not even Ethan. Her husband kept his eyes fixed on the boarding passes in his hands, saying nothing while strangers nearby slowed their pace to watch. Margaret smiled wider. "Go home, Vilya. You're not coming with us." For a long second, Vilya simply looked at the ship towering above the harbor. Then, to everyone's confusion, she smiled. Without arguing. Without crying. Without begging. She stepped away from the counter and quietly waited beside the boarding gate. Margaret laughed under her breath. Finally, she's accepted it. None of them noticed the bridge officer crossing the terminal suddenly stop in mid-step. He looked directly at Vilya. His expression changed instantly. Lifting the radio clip to his shoulder, he spoke only a few quiet words before turning toward the ship. Less than a minute later, the captain himself walked down the gangway. He headed straight toward Vilya. 3 months earlier, Vilya had been the one comparing cabin layouts, researching shore excursions, and making sure everyone in Ethan's family could travel together without exceeding anyone's budget. It was supposed to celebrate her and Ethan's 10th wedding anniversary. Margaret had insisted the entire family should come. "It'll be unforgettable," she'd said. Vilya believed her. She even paid for several family excursions after learning Ethan's younger brother couldn't afford them. She never mentioned it again because she didn't want anyone feeling embarrassed. Now she stood outside the boarding line, carrying the same suitcase she had packed for that anniversary, while another woman occupied the suite she had originally selected. Margaret adjusted the scarf around Linda's neck with almost theatrical affection. "There," she said loudly, "that cabin suits you much better." Linda looked uncomfortable, but accepted the boarding pass anyway. Ethan finally looked at his wife. "Vilya." She waited. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Margaret answered for him. "Don't start making this dramatic. We already solved the problem." "The problem?" Vilya asked quietly. Margaret didn't hesitate. "You've never really fit into this family vacation. This arrangement makes everyone happier." Nobody challenged her. One by one, relatives began boarding. Some avoided looking at Vilya altogether. Others offered awkward half-smiles before disappearing onto the ship. The silence hurt far more than Margaret's words. The final boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. Margaret picked up her handbag. "Well," she said with a satisfied smirk, "I suppose this is goodbye." She turned toward the gangway. That was when the bridge officer hurried back, stopping directly beside the captain. The older man looked at Vilya for only a second before his face softened into genuine recognition. He walked past Margaret without acknowledging her, extended his hand toward Vilya, and said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Welcome back, ma'am. We've been expecting you." Margaret stopped so abruptly that Linda nearly walked into her. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, forcing a laugh. "I think you've mistaken her for someone else." The captain didn't even glance in Margaret's direction. Instead, he offered Vilya a warm, professional smile. "It's good to see you again, Ms. Brooks." Vilya shook his hand. "Thank you, Captain Harris. It's good to be back." Behind them, Ethan frowned. "Back?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Vilya turned toward him, unsure how to answer. I can explain later. Margaret stepped between them. No, I'd like the explanation now. Captain Harris finally acknowledged her presence. And you are? I'm her mother-in-law. I see. Nothing more. No apology. No introduction. No attempt to justify himself. The captain simply returned his attention to Vilya, as though the interruption had never happened. I trust your trip here was comfortable. It was, Vilya replied. Thank you. Margaret folded her arms. This is ridiculous. She doesn't even work here. No, Vilya answered calmly. I don't. Then why does the captain know your name? Vilya hesitated. I've done some work with the company. Margaret gave an exaggerated laugh. Office paperwork, I'm guessing. The comment drew a few uncomfortable glances from nearby passengers. It wasn't the first time she dismissed Vilya's career with those exact words. At family dinners, whenever someone asked about Vilya's job, Margaret always answered before she could. Nothing exciting, she'd say, just paperwork. Eventually, Vilya had stopped correcting her. It seemed easier than arguing. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly don't know much about what you actually do. Vilya looked at him. You never asked. The words weren't angry. They were quiet. Matter of fact. Ethan couldn't deny it. Whenever conversations turned toward work, his mother inevitably redirected them toward Ethan's business, his brother's promotions, or one of Margaret's friends. Vilya simply faded into the background. Over time, everyone accepted that she had an ordinary office job. Even Ethan. Captain Harris studied the exchange without saying a word. Then he looked back at Vilya. I've always appreciated your discretion. Margaret frowned. Discretion. Vilya gave a small smile. I don't usually talk about clients. That answer only seemed to confuse everyone more. Before Margaret could ask another question, two senior officers emerged from the gangway. The first officer spotted Vilya immediately. His face brightened. Ms. Brooks. He walked over and extended his hand enthusiastically. It's wonderful to see you again. You too, Commander Ellis. The commander laughed. I still tell new officers about your inspection. Margaret blinked. Inspection. Commander Ellis smiled at Vilya. I don't think any of us slept for a week afterward. Several nearby crew members chuckled knowingly. Another officer joined them. None of us have forgotten what you did for the fleet. Vilya lowered her eyes modestly. It was a team effort. No, the officer replied. It really wasn't. Ethan looked from one uniformed officer to another. What exactly did my wife do? No one answered. Instead, the officers exchanged quick looks, as though they had almost said too much. Captain Harris smoothly changed the subject. Ms. Brooks, I hope you're still planning to attend this afternoon's executive meeting. I wouldn't miss it. Excellent, they're looking forward to your report. Margaret's confident expression faltered for the first time that morning. Executive meeting. The words came out almost involuntarily. She looked at Ethan, then at the officers, then back at Vilya. Something important was happening. Something she clearly hadn't anticipated. And for the first time since arriving at the terminal, Margaret realized she might not know her daughter-in-law nearly as well as she thought she did. Who exactly was Vilya to this cruise line? Before anyone could answer Margaret's question, boarding slowed to an unexpected halt. A guest services supervisor hurried toward Captain Harris carrying a tablet. Two security officers took discreet positions nearby, not because anyone was in danger, but because the captain had stopped in the middle of passenger boarding. Curious travelers began whispering as they watched the scene unfold. Margaret lifted her chin. This is getting absurd. she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. She isn't even a passenger anymore. You're delaying hundreds of people over someone whose reservation was canceled. The supervisor looked from Margaret to Vilya. Captain. Captain Harris nodded once. Please verify Ms. Brooks' arrival. The supervisor tapped through several screens. Margaret folded her arms with a satisfied smile. There, you'll see she has no booking. The supervisor paused, then frowned. He wasn't looking at the passenger manifest. He had opened something else entirely. Captain, the supervisor said respectfully, Ms. Brooks' executive arrival has been confirmed. Margaret blinked. An executive? Yes. He turned the tablet so the captain could review it. The invitation was issued by corporate operations several months ago. Her accommodations, meeting schedule, and security access are already active. Vilya remained silent. Captain Harris smiled. Thank you. The supervisor nodded before turning back to Vilya. Welcome aboard, Ms. Brooks. Ethan stared at his wife. You already had another reservation. It isn't another reservation, Vilya answered carefully. It's separate. Margaret laughed sharply. Separate, that's impossible. The supervisor remained perfectly professional. Ma'am, executive invitations are managed independently from guest reservations. So I removed her from our booking. Yes. And now she somehow still gets on the ship. Yes. Margaret's smile disappeared. This has to be some kind of mistake, she insisted. I personally had her name removed 3 days ago. The words escaped before she seemed to realize what she had admitted. Silence settled over the group. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. You did what? Margaret hesitated. I handled it. You told me there had been a booking error. It was easier that way. You lied to me. Several relatives stopped walking. His younger brother frowned. You actually canceled Vilya yourself. Margaret tried to recover. I was doing what was best for this family. Linda lowered her eyes. You told me the cabin had become available. Margaret avoided looking at her. Nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The story had changed completely. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a computer error. It had been deliberate. Guest services spoke gently but firmly. Ms. Brooks' executive access cannot be modified or canceled by another guest. Margaret's face flushed. I paid for this vacation. That doesn't affect executive credentials. I don't care what credentials she has. I'm sorry, ma'am. Company policy is very clear. For the first time that morning, Margaret had no authority. No amount of money. No family influence. No raised voice. None of it mattered. Captain Harris stepped beside Vilya. If you're ready, Ms. Brooks, I'd be honored to escort you aboard. He extended his arm toward the priority entrance instead of the standard boarding line. The executive reception begins shortly. Every conversation around them seemed to stop. Passengers watched as the woman who had just been told to go home was escorted toward the ship by its captain himself. Margaret could only stand frozen on the pier, watching the balance of power shift with every step Vilya took up the gangway. Vilya had barely stepped onto the gangway when Margaret found her voice again. Captain. Her sharp call echoed across the boarding area. Captain Harris stopped and turned, his expression composed. Margaret hurried forward, ignoring the startled looks from her family. I demand an explanation. The captain remained polite. Of what, ma'am? Why she's being treated like some executive when she's just... Margaret caught herself before finishing the sentence. Just what? Vilya asked quietly. Margaret looked away. Captain Harris answered instead. Perhaps it's best if I explain. He gestured toward a quieter area just inside the terminal entrance, where boarding could continue without interruption. Ethan, His brother, Linda, and several relatives instinctively followed. No one wanted to leave without finally understanding what was happening. Captain Harris folded his hands behind his back. Several years ago, our company undertook the largest fleet-wide safety compliance review in its history. Ethan listened intently. I remember hearing something about that in the news. The captain nodded. It was an extensive process. Every vessel, every procedure, every emergency protocol was evaluated. He looked toward Vilya. Ms. Brooks served as the independent lead compliance auditor. Margaret frowned. An auditor? Not an internal employee, the captain clarified. An external specialist appointed to conduct an objective review. Vilya remained silent. She had never been comfortable discussing the project. It wasn't glamorous, she said softly. It was important, Captain Harris corrected. The captain continued. During that review, Ms. Brooks identified several operational weaknesses that had gone unnoticed for years. Ethan's eyes widened. Serious weaknesses. They required immediate correction. Captain Harris spoke carefully, choosing words that respected company confidentiality. Her recommendations fundamentally improved how this fleet operates today. Commander Ellis stepped forward. I was serving on another ship at the time. He smiled at Vilya. I'll never forget the first meeting after her report. Another senior officer nodded. Most people only notice luxury. We noticed lives being protected. The words settled over the group. Vilya looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. I was only doing my job. Commander Ellis chuckled. You were doing it better than anyone expected. Everything Ethan had heard over the past few minutes suddenly began fitting together. The officers recognizing her immediately. The warm greetings. The references to the fleet. The executive meeting. The separate reservation. The captain personally coming to the terminal. None of it had been coincidence. He looked at his wife with an expression she had never seen before. Not confusion. Recognition. I never knew. You never asked, Vilya replied gently. He lowered his eyes. I know. Margaret suddenly stepped forward again. This is completely overblown. Her voice was louder now, edged with frustration. So she wrote a report years ago. Commander Ellis's expression hardened. Respectfully, ma'am. Captain Harris raised a hand slightly, signaling that he would respond. Our company still operates under procedures developed from Ms. Brooks' recommendations. Margaret folded her arms. That doesn't make her special. No, Captain Harris agreed calmly. It makes her responsible. The distinction landed harder than any insult could have. Several nearby passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. Even members of the Brooks family shifted uncomfortably. Margaret had spent years dismissing Vilya's career as insignificant. Now senior officers were describing it as foundational. Still unwilling to let the moment go, Margaret took another step toward the captain. There has to be some mistake. Before she could continue, one of the ship's security supervisors approached. His tone remained respectful. Ma'am, boarding operations are still underway. I have every right to ask questions. Of course. He nodded politely. But interfering with executive operations isn't permitted. Margaret stared at him. Executive operations. The phrase seemed to drain the last certainty from her expression. She glanced around. For the first time, no one in her family stood beside her. Linda had quietly moved away. Ethan remained next to Vilya. Even Margaret's younger son avoided meeting her eyes. Years of unquestioned authority were slipping away in front of strangers. Captain Harris turned toward the executive entrance. Several well-dressed company officials had just arrived. One smiled as soon as he saw Vilya. There you are. He extended his hand. We've been waiting for you. Captain Harris looked back toward the Brooks family. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "allow me to introduce the guest our executive team has been expecting." The executive waiting near the entrance crossed the polished floor with confident strides, extending his hand before Vilya could say a word. "Ms. Brooks," he said warmly, "it's an honor to have you back." Vilya smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." He turned toward the small crowd that had unintentionally gathered near the gangway. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Vilya Brooks, the independent maritime safety compliance auditor who led the fleet-wide review that transformed our operational standards." A murmur spread through the nearby passengers. Mr. Holloway continued. "Several years ago, our company invited outside experts to conduct the most comprehensive safety assessment in our history. Ms. Brooks' work identified critical weaknesses in our procedures." He paused. "Her recommendations became mandatory operating standards across our fleet." Captain Harris nodded. "I can personally say that every captain sailing for this company benefits from the systems she helped build." Commander Ellis smiled. "So do our crews." Another executive added, "and every passenger who steps aboard." The terminal fell quiet. No applause. No dramatic outburst. Just the weight of the truth settling over everyone who had witnessed Vilya's humiliation only minutes earlier. Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law as if she were seeing her for the first time. "You never told us." Vilya answered honestly. "I tried." She looked toward Ethan. "The first few times people asked about my work, you remember what happened." Ethan did. Every conversation had ended the same way. Margaret would wave a dismissive hand. "It's only office paperwork." Everyone would laugh politely. The discussion would move on. Eventually, Vilya stopped bringing it up altogether. Not because she was ashamed. Because no one wanted to hear it. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "I thought staying quiet kept the peace." Vilya looked at him. "It kept me invisible." Those 5 words hit harder than anything else she'd said all morning. Linda slowly removed the keycard Margaret had given her. She walked over to Vilya. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me one." "I accepted that cabin because Margaret told me you'd canceled." Linda glanced toward Margaret. "I never imagined she had taken it from you." She held out the keycard. "This belongs to you." Before Vilya could respond, Mr. Holloway smiled. "Actually," he reached into his jacket and produced another envelope. "Ms. Brooks won't be using that suite." He handed her a navy blue key wallet embossed with the company's crest. "Your executive accommodations have been prepared on deck 12. Margaret's eyes widened. "Executive?" Captain Harris smiled. "The reservation has been waiting for months." It had never depended on the family booking. It had never been affected by Margaret's decision. The cabin she canceled had become irrelevant long before the cruise began. Ethan finally stepped in front of his mother. His voice remained calm. "Why?" Margaret blinked. "What? Why did you remove Vilya?" She searched for an answer that sounded reasonable. Instead, the truth slipped out. "I didn't think she belonged on this trip." Silence. Not one relative defended her. Ethan slowly shook his head. "This trip was supposed to celebrate our anniversary." Margaret looked away. "I wanted family together." Ethan's younger brother spoke quietly. "She is family." Another cousin nodded. "And she paid for half the excursions." Several relatives exchanged embarrassed looks. They had enjoyed Vilya's generosity for months without realizing she had quietly covered costs so everyone could participate. Margaret's influence, once unquestioned, seemed to dissolve in the space of a few minutes. No argument could erase what everyone had witnessed. She had lied. She had humiliated her daughter-in-law in public. and she had done it intentionally. Captain Harris checked his watch. "If everyone is ready, we'll begin boarding." His tone was courteous, but the moment was over. The executives walked beside Vilya toward the priority entrance. Before stepping through the doors, she stopped. She turned back to Ethan. "I meant what I said earlier." He looked up. "You never asked." He nodded slowly. "I know. I'm willing to rebuild what we have." She held his gaze. "But I won't disappear to make someone else comfortable again." He swallowed. "You never should have had to." It wasn't a promise that everything would be fixed. It was the first honest conversation they'd had in years. And for Vilya, honesty mattered more than quick forgiveness. The cruise itself became very different from what Margaret had imagined. Instead of controlling every family dinner and excursion, she found herself sitting through uncomfortable meals where conversations naturally drifted toward Vilya's work. Relatives who had barely spoken to Vilya before asked genuine questions. Crew members greeted her by name whenever they crossed paths. Executives invited her to discussions about future safety initiatives. Margaret rarely interrupted. When she did, no one rushed to support her. The authority she had relied on for years had quietly disappeared. Not because anyone punished her. Because trust, once broken so publicly, could not simply be demanded back. Several months later, Vilya accepted a permanent advisory role with the cruise company. The position allowed her to continue improving passenger and crew safety while consulting across the fleet. At home, she and Ethan made changes that were long overdue. Family invitations were accepted only when they came with mutual respect. Boundaries replaced silent endurance. Conversations replaced avoidance. For the first time in their marriage, Ethan defended his wife before anyone else had to. Margaret was still part of the family, but she was no longer allowed to decide who belonged. One clear afternoon, Vilya stood on the bridge of another ship beside Captain Harris as it eased away from the harbor. He smiled. "Welcome back, ma'am." This time, the words carried no surprise. Only quiet recognition. Vilya watched the shoreline fade into the distance and realized that the day someone had told her to go home had become the day she finally stopped asking permission to belong.